Welcome to a Moment in Time podcast. I'm your host, Eric.
And I'm Freya. I want you to just imagine for a second that you're standing on this dry, sun-baked ridge in what is today the Middle East.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Yeah, and it's roughly, 8,000 years ago. For generations, your people, right, these nomadic hunter-gatherers, have lived in this massive, lush basin. It's roughly the size of Great Britain.
That's huge.
Right. And it's basically this oasis that's totally shielded from the brutal Ice Age climate that's gripping the rest of the planet. It's watered by this massive network of converging rivers. So it's, for all intents and purposes, a literal paradise of endless foraging.
A safe haven.
Exactly. But on this one particular day, you hear a sound like just continuous, rolling thunder. You look toward the horizon and you see the Indian Ocean violently breaching what we now call the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, wow, because the sea level had been rising, right?
Yeah, for centuries. And now the natural dam has just completely broken. Millions of tons of salt water come pouring into the basin, swallowing the forests, drowning the plains, and violently erasing your ancestral homeland.
Just entirely wiping it from the face of the earth.
Completely. For the people fleeing north into the unknown, it was an apocalyptic climate catastrophe. But for us, listening to this today, it might actually be the exact historical moment the concept of the Garden of Eden was born.
It's such a profound shift in perspective. We're so used to viewing Eden as this Sunday school painting.
Right, like a couple standing next to an apple tree with a friendly lion just hanging out nearby.
Exactly, yeah. But when you start treating the text as an artifact, as a potential record of deep geographical trauma or evolutionary psychology, you realize this isn't just a story about a piece of fruit.
No, not at all.
It's actually the ultimate diagnostic tool for the human condition. You weren't just looking for some lost geographical location, You're looking for an explanation of why human beings feel so, fundamentally alienated from the natural world.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this deep dive right now, you are probably someone who craves that exact kind of historical and psychological excavation. You want to understand the actual machinery behind the myth.
Right.
So today we are taking this massive, highly intimidating stack of sources, and we're synthesizing them to answer just a single, incredibly complex question, which is, what actually was the Garden of Eden?
Was it a literal set of GPS coordinates in the mountains of Iran?
Right. Or was it a sunken prehistoric oasis in the Persian Gulf?
Or maybe a cultural memory of the agricultural revolution?
Or, is it just a purely spiritual blueprint for the architecture of the human soul?
Well, to tackle a question with that kind of crazy scope, we really have to establish a rigorous ground rule for this deep dive.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we're looking at, fierce theological essays published in 1869. We've got cutting-edge geological surveys of ancient ocean transgressions, linguistic breakdowns of ancient Hebrew.
And translations of Babylonian cuneiform tablets. It's a lot.
It is. So the ground rule is we are treating all these incredibly diverse perspectives, the archaeology, the theology, the geology, and the mythology, as equal puzzle pieces.
We aren't picking sides.
Right, exactly. We're not trying to declare that, a geologist somehow defeats a theologian or vice versa. We're simply using their collective insights to impartially understand how humanity has wrestled with the trauma of its own origins.
Exactly. We're looking at the evolution of the idea itself, but I think before we can grab our archaeological shovels and start tracing ancient riverbeds, we really have to understand the sheer, almost crushing weight this story carries in Western thought.
It's foundational.
Yeah, because for centuries, looking for Eden wasn't just some historical curiosity. It was an absolute existential necessity. Like, if you could not prove the physical reality of this garden, the entire structure of the dominant Western religion was basically perceived to be in jeopardy.
The stakes were absolute. And to really understand that mindset, we have to immerse ourselves in a really specific piece of historical literature we have in our sources today.
The 1869 essay.
Yeah, it's an essay from the Methodist Quarterly Review, published in 1869. The title is just straight to the point, Literality of the Account of the Garden of Eden.
Right, no ambiguity there.
None. The author writes with this kind of intense, almost defensive passion, arguing for the absolute, historical, literal reality of Eden. For this writer, and really for the vast theological tradition they represent, Eden cannot be reduced to a myth.
Or even a helpful allegory.
Exactly. Because if it is an allegory, they argue that the structural integrity of the entire Christian historical record just collapses entirely.
I found the mechanics of the author's argument so fascinating because it operates almost like a legal defense of a timeline.
It really does read like a legal brief sometimes.
Yeah, like the author points out that the biblical text traces the genealogy of Christ generation by generation all the way back to a historical Adam, and the logic is actually remarkably straightforward.
Right, the genealogical argument.
Yeah, if you render the garden into a myth, then the man placed inside the garden becomes a myth. And if the first man in the genealogical record is a myth, at what exact point does the factual history actually begin?
It creates a massive crisis of continuity.
Right. You trace the line backward, Jesus to David, David to Abraham, Abraham to Noah, Noah to Seth, Seth to Adam. The author argues that if Adam is a metaphor, the genealogy of a historical figure like Jesus just terminates in a fairy tale.
Which undermines the historical validity of the entire ledger.
It's a total domino effect.
Yeah.
If the first domino is made of air, how did the rest of them fall over?
That's a great way to put it. And, that genealogical crisis is really just the surface layer. The much deeper anxiety for this 1869 author concerns the theology of the Apostle Paul.
Oh, this part was super dense.
It is, but it's crucial. If you read the New Testament epistles, specifically Romans chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you find that Paul's entire metaphysical framework for redemption rests on what theologians call the one-man argument.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So, Paul leans heavily into this concept of federal headship. It's the idea that one individual acts as the representative for the entire collective.
Right, he writes, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. It's basically a mathematical equation.
It is precisely an equation. Paul argues that through one historical man, Adam, the virus of sin and physical death entered the material world. Therefore, the cure can only be administered through another historical man, Christ bringing redemption.
Which is why the author is so freaked out by allegories.
Exactly. The 1869 author is terrified by the implications of allegorizing Eden because it just pulls the foundational premise right out from under Pauline theology. If the first Adam wasn't a physical human being who committed a literal transgression in a literal physical garden,
then what was the second Adam actually redeeming humanity from?
Right. The theological mechanics require a literal fracture to justify a literal repair.
I mean, I understand the internal logic of the theology, but reading the primary source, I really found myself pushing back on the author's defense against the scientific community.
Oh, the science section is wild.
It is. The author claims that modern science doesn't actually contradict the literal existence of Eden, primarily because science simply, quote-unquote, doesn't reach it.
Right.
The essay asserts that geology, astronomy, anatomy, none of these disciplines touch the reality of Eden, but that just feels, I don't know, intellectually evasive.
How so?
Well, if Eden was a physical location on planet Earth, interacting with the Earth's atmosphere, its soil, its hydrology, shouldn't there be earthly scientific evidence of its existence? By declaring it totally immune to scientific scrutiny, isn't the author just pulling the geographical equivalent of, like, you can't see my girlfriend because she goes to another school?
That is a hilarious analogy. But, it certainly reads as a highly protective maneuver to modern eyes.
Mm-hmm.
We do, however, have to contextualize the historical moment of 1869.
Okay, set the scene for us.
The intellectual ground was shifting violently at that time. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species had been published exactly a decade prior in 1859.
Right, so evolution is suddenly on the table.
Exactly. And Charles Lyell's principles of uniformitarian geology were vastly expanding the timeline of the Earth's age, completely dismantling the idea of a young 6,000-year-old planet. So this author is watching this scientific method just rapidly consume territories that previously belonged exclusively to theology.
So they're essentially drawing a hard boundary line in the sand.
Exactly. They're building a theological fortress. The argument is basically, you can have the strata of the rocks in the deep time of the cosmos, but this specific geographical location and the specific event that occurred within it are completely shielded by divine revelation. The scientific method is just inadequate to measure the miraculous.
The author is willing to concede certain things, sure, but Eden is the load-bearing pillar.
And the essay warns of a very specific danger if that pillar falls, which is the slippery slope of allegorical interpretation.
Oh yeah, they get really intense about this.
Very. The author explicitly asks the reader, if you allow Eden to be read as a myth, what stops you from dismantling the rest of the text?
Right, like if the garden is just a metaphor for human innocence, then what about the global flood?
Or Jonah in the belly of the great fish.
Yeah, or Moses being drawn from the bulrushes. If you start allegorizing all the physical, historical landmarks of the text, the author warns that believers will be left drifting before a storm of skepticism, with literally no anchor of literal truth to hold them in place.
The author even points to specific internal prophecies to prove this structural dependency. In the Genesis account, right after the transgression, God speaks to the serpent and prophesies that the seed of the woman will eventually bruise the serpent's head.
I remember that part.
Yeah, the 1869 author points out that this is the proto-evangelium, the very first proclamation of the gospel. Christian tradition views this as a direct prophecy of a virgin birth and the ultimate victory of Christ.
So the author argues that this prophecy requires a literal, physical fulfillment.
Exactly, which means it must have been spoken in a literal, physical garden. The entire narrative architecture from Genesis to Revelation is inextricably linked in their view.
So from this 19th century perspective, a purely historical, geographical Eden is the absolute prerequisite for faith. But what is so fascinating to me about theology is that it's just never a monolith.
Never.
Because if we look at another source in our stack today, we find this deeply profound counterargument. Some thinkers argue that insisting on a literal geographical reading doesn't actually save the story, it completely limits its power.
Yeah, they argue it shrinks the narrative.
Right. If you make Eden just this tiny plot of land in the ancient Near East, you shrink a massive cosmic truth into a minor historical footnote.
Which brings us to a completely different frequency of interpretation, one that actually predates our 1869 author by 1,000 years, yet somehow feels incredibly modern in its psychological depth.
Yeah, this part of the deep dive blew my mind.
It's amazing. We are looking at an analysis from the New Eden Ministry, focusing on the teachings of a 9th century Irish philosopher and theologian named John Scotus Eriugena. Right, and Eriugena's framework just entirely dismantles the physical fortress of the literalists and builds something completely different.
Because in his theology, the Garden of Eden is absolutely not a set of coordinates on a map. It's not a place you could hike to, even if you had a literal time machine.
No, for Eriugena, Eden is a spiritual reality. It is a highly sophisticated symbolic blueprint of human nature itself.
So the landscape is us.
Exactly. Eriugena was heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, which viewed reality as this series of emanations from a perfect infinite source. In this framework, when the text describes the garden, it is describing the original uncorrupted condition of the human soul.
So all the physical stuff in this story.
The topography of Eden, the rivers, the trees, the boundaries, they're all psychological and spiritual architecture. The tree of life situated in the very center of the garden is not some biological plant, It is a symbol of the divine logos, or Christ, the sustaining source of all goodness within the human consciousness.
What really struck me about Eriugena's framework is how it totally contradicts the default popular perception of paradise.
Oh, it flips it on its head.
Yeah, because when most people imagine Eden, they picture a state of flawless, frozen stasis. Adam and Eve are just lounging on the grass. A lion is peacefully chewing cud next to a lamb. The weather is a permanent 72 degrees, and just nothing ever happens.
The diorama of static perfection.
Exactly. But Eriugena argues that Eden was never designed to be static. Human nature wasn't created to sit still. It was designed to evolve.
This is perhaps Eriugena's most profound insight. If Eden represents human nature, then the garden must be a dynamic, growing entity. He posits that God created human nature with the ultimate goal of achieving complete union with the Creator.
Right.
But because the Creator is infinite, the process of a finite creature uniting with that infinite source cannot be achieved in a single moment. It requires an infinite, eternal progression.
So the original state of humanity was this endless journey of expanding discovery, not some stagnant retirement community.
Exactly. And this radically alters how we understand the concept of the fall.
This is the part that really clicked for me.
In the literalist tradition, the eating of the forbidden fruit is a plunge from a state of perfect stasis into a state of total depravity, right? But for Eriugena, the transgression was an interruption.
Just a pause. Or a crash.
A crash. Adam and Eve were on a trajectory of infinite progression into the good, the true, and the beautiful. Eating the fruit introduced duality into their consciousness, the knowledge of good and evil, the fracturing of their single-minded focus on the divine. It catastrophically derailed their trajectory.
To put it in modern terms, I mean, it's not like they were evicted from a luxury apartment building for violating the lease agreement. It's more like human nature is a highly advanced operating system.
Right, I like this analogy.
Yeah. And the original design was for it to continuously download an infinite software update from the cloud, an update that expands our capacity for beauty and truth forever. But the introduction of duality was a virus.
It corrupted the download.
It interrupted the download catastrophically. And now our operating system is just glitching out in the wilderness. We have the hardware meant to process infinite beauty, but our software is corrupted, leaving us alienated, anxious, and just constantly crashing.
That is a remarkably precise translation of Erigena's Neoplatonic concepts into contemporary language. We are wandering outside the garden, which means we are fundamentally wandering outside the parameters of our own true nature.
We're out of alignment.
We feel alienated because we are operating out of alignment with our original code. And the historical texts that developed around these ideas offer these vivid, almost hallucinatory illustrations of how humanity might actually attempt to reboot that system.
Which brings us to the apocryphal Old Irish text mentioned in the source material.
Yes, the Irish text.
Now, obviously this isn't part of the canonical Bible, but as a piece of theological literature illustrating Erigena's spiritual framework, it is absolutely mesmerizing.
It is incredibly poetic.
It tells the story of Adam and Eve immediately after the expulsion from the garden. They are wandering in the wilderness, they're starving, and they are overwhelmed by the sudden, brutal reality of their glitching nature. They decide they have to perform a radical act of penance to heal the fracture.
The imagery in this text is incredibly potent. They decide to immerse themselves in the flowing waters of the earth.
Right. Adam goes to the river Jordan, and Eve goes to the river Tigris. The text describes them standing neck-deep in the freezing, flowing water. Eve is completely submerged, save for her face, with her hair just floating out on the current.
It's a literal sensory shock to the system.
Yeah. And Adam calls out to Eve across the geographical distance, instructing her to beg all of creation to pray with them. And then the text describes this crazy suspension of the natural order.
The miracle.
Yeah, the flow of the river completely stops. The water just freezes in time. The fish and the aquatic creatures become utterly still. Slowly, all the animals of the wild gather around Adam on the riverbank, and they join his penance.
It's a beautiful image.
The rivers, the animals, Adam and Eve all unite their silent prayers and send them upward to the angelic choirs surrounding the divine.
It is a stunning piece of mythological poetry. But we have to remember, it is not just poetry. It is a coded instruction manual.
Wait, really?
Yes. The New Eden Ministry Sermon breaks this narrative down into what is known in Christian mysticism as the triple way of spirituality. It's a three-stage process for basically debugging that corrupted human operating system you mentioned.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that because it maps so perfectly onto human psychology.
The first stage is ascetic practice, which is represented by standing neck-deep in the freezing water. Asceticism is the voluntary embrace of discomfort to discipline the body and the mind.
So cold plunges are actually ancient mysticism.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
In the context of our software analogy, this is the hard reboot. Standing in freezing water forces the mind to abandon all its chaotic, dualistic anxieties. You aren't thinking about the past or the future. You are entirely present in the absolute shock of the cold.
It forces you to just be there.
It is a purification of the heart, silencing the noise of the glitching software.
It's basically sensory deprivation designed to reset the baseline. And so what's the second stage?
The second stage is the union with nature, represented by the flowing river stopping and the wild animals gathering to join the prayer. This symbolizes the restoration of natural harmony.
Because right now we are definitely not in harmony.
Exactly. Because the human operating system was corrupted, humanity fell out of rhythm with the ecological world. We view nature as something to be conquered or feared. But in this stage of spiritual progression, the human soul realigns with the frequency of the created order.
The hostility just vanishes.
Right. The animals pray with the humans because the humans are no longer a threat. They have returned to their intended role as the harmonic center of creation.
They have stabilized the hardware, which I guess allows for the final stage.
Yes, the third stage is deification, or joining the angels. Once the mind is purified by asceticism and realigned through natural union, the human soul can finally resume that interrupted software download.
The prayers rise up to the angels.
Yes, signifying the resumption of humanity's infinite progression into the divine mystery. The finite creature is once again participating in the infinite life of the Creator. So Eden is restored, but not as a geographical location. It's restored as an internal state of being.
It is such a breathtakingly elegant framework. It totally solves the problem of geological evidence by just rendering the physical geography completely irrelevant.
It does.
But, here is the friction point that kind of drives our deep dive forward. If Eriugena is right, and Eden is a purely spiritual reality, just an internal state of mind, why do the original ancient Hebrew words used in the book of Genesis seem to describe highly specific physical architecture?
Yes.
Like, if it's just a mindset, why does the text use vocabulary that belongs on an ancient surveyor's blueprint?
That is the exact vulnerability in the purely allegorical approach. The text of Genesis is remarkably grounded in ancient Near Eastern dirt, and this is exactly where Arthur H. Lewis enters the conversation.
Right. We are looking at Lewis's paper presented to the Evangelical Theological Society. And Lewis's approach is fascinating because he comes in and essentially tells both the 19th century literalists and the allegorical spiritualists that they are both misreading the data.
He takes on everybody.
He does. He pushes back against the people who say it's just a myth, but he forcefully dismantles a very specific popular evangelical assumption, the idea of a universal global paradise.
Yes, the universal paradise theory is a deeply entrenched cultural assumption. It's the idea that before the transgression in Eden, the entire globe, from the Arctic to the Sahara, was a flawless, deathless utopia.
No carnivores, no poisonous plants, no natural disasters anywhere on planet Earth.
Exactly. But Lewis argues that this view is not only scientifically unsupportable, but it is actually a severe misreading of the original Hebrew text. His entire argument hinges on a rigorous linguistic analysis of two specific words, Adama and Gan.
The linguistic breakdown completely reoriented how I understand the geography of this story.
Yeah.
Let's start with Adama, because the English translations usually just render it as the ground or the earth.
Which is too broad.
Way too broad. Lewis points out that Adama carries a much more specific connotation in ancient Hebrew. It refers to the wild, uncultivated, untamed soil. It is the wilderness. It is the rough, chaotic, natural world where survival requires intense, brutal labor.
Exactly. Adama is the default harsh state of the terrestrial world. And in stark contrast to that, we have the word Gan.
G-A-N.
Yes. In English, we translate it simply as garden, which, evokes images of a backyard vegetable patch or a quaint little flower bed. But the Hebrew root of Gan is actually a verb that means to protect, to defend, or to enclose.
Oh, wow.
It always describes a heavily fortified, walled, or fenced-in area. It is an architectural term for a protected enclave.
Which is why the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, chose to translate Gan using the Persian loanword part.
Yes, pardes,
Yeah.
which is the etymological origin of our English word paradise.
So cool.
In ancient Persia, a pardes was a walled royal park. It was a massive, enclosed hunting and pleasure garden built by the king, surrounded by massive walls, specifically to keep the chaotic wilderness out.
So a Gan is not a global condition. It is a highly localized, heavily fortified safe zone. And the text of Genesis explicitly states that God planted a Gan in Eden.
That's a huge distinction.
Right.
Yeah.
Eden is a larger geographical region, and the garden is a specific walled-off sanctuary planted within that larger region. Lewis points out that the text says God formed the man out of the dust of the Adama, the wild, untamed wilderness outside, and then placed him into the protected Gan.
The implications of this are massive.
They really are, because it fundamentally changes the mechanics of the fall that we've been talking about. If the world outside the walled garden was always the wild Adama, if there were always lions hunting prey and thorns growing on bushes and harsh weather systems operating outside those walls, doesn't that mean the natural world wasn't cursed into existence by human sin?
It was already there.
It was already there.
That is precisely Lewis's argument. The curse pronounced upon humanity was not a magical, cosmic event that suddenly gave animals sharp teeth and mutated plants to grow thorns. The natural world was already operating according to the harsh laws of biology and ecology. The punishment was simply an eviction.
It makes the ending of the Genesis narrative so much more logical. God expels the humans and places cherubim with a flaming sword at the eastern gate to guard the entrance.
Right.
If the entire planet was a magical paradise, guarding one gate makes literally no sense. You could just walk in from the north or the south.
Exact.
But if the garden is a fortified safe room, the cherubim are basically celestial bouncers holding the only door. They aren't keeping humanity out of a mystical dimension. They are locking the doors to the sanctuary, forcing humanity out into the pre-existing, brutal reality of the Adama. They are driven back into the wild dirt from which they were originally taken.
And Lewis substantiates this interpretation by pulling back the lens to look at the broader literary context of the ancient Near East. The Hebrews were not developing their theology in a vacuum.
They had neighbors.
They had major neighboring civilizations. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Canaanites, and all of these cultures shared a strikingly similar geographical motif. They all possessed cultural memories of a localized utopian bliss that was explicitly separated from a hostile natural world.
The neighbors had their own walled gardens.
They did. We can look at the ancient Sumerian text regarding a place called Dilmun. In Sumerian mythology, Dilmun was a sacred, pure, and bright land where the freshwater god Enki resided.
And it sounds a lot like Eden.
It really does. The cuneiform tablets explicitly contrast Dilmun with the natural world, stating, "In Dilmun the raven utters no cry, the lion kills not, the wolf snatches not the lamb." It was an enclave where the brutal laws of the food chain were suspended.
And they weren't the only ones.
No, similarly, the Babylonians venerated the ancient city-state of Eridu, viewing it as an original place of pristine divine order. The Canaanites looked to Mount Zaphon, a holy mountain peak where the gods lived in perfect harmony above the chaos of the terrestrial plains.
So there is this unified regional consensus in antiquity. Across all these different linguistic and cultural groups in the Middle East, there is a shared psychological and literary structure. The world is chaotic, violent, and hard, but there is, or there was, a localized, protected sanctuary where the gods and early humans lived in peace.
Yes. For Arthur H. Lewis, this literary context proves that the author of Genesis is utilizing a well-known regional concept to describe a real, localized geographic location, not a global condition or a purely spiritual state. The text is describing a physical park.
And if it is a physical park, we have a mandate to find it. Because the author of Genesis didn't just say it was somewhere over the rainbow, the text provides incredibly specific topographical landmarks.
Very specific.
It states that a river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides into 4 distinct branches, forming 4 major rivers: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Pison, and the Gihon.
This is the geographic puzzle that has driven explorers mad for millennia.
Because 2 of those rivers are easy. The Tigris and the Euphrates are massive, historically vital waterways that flow right through modern-day Iraq and Turkey. We know exactly where they are.
We can point to them on a map right now.
Right. But the other 2, the Pison and the Gihon, are basically the great missing links of biblical archaeology. They just seem to have vanished from modern maps. But if Lewis is right, and the Gihon was a real physical place, those rivers have to exist. Which means it is time to bring the archaeologists into our deep dive.
And not just any archaeologist. We are turning to a fascinating 1999 article from the Jerusalem Report, which profiles the work of a rather flamboyant and highly controversial British Egyptologist and archaeologist named David Roll.
David Roll.
Yeah. Roll is not interested in spiritual metaphors or generalized literary motifs. He treats the book of Genesis as a literal historical logbook, like an oral tradition passed down by a real prehistoric tribe that eventually got written down.
Roll's methodology is wild because he approaches the text like a forensic geographer. He is looking for a location that satisfies every single clue provided in the Genesis account, and he claims to have found the exact valley.
The exact spot.
Not a metaphor. A real, lush, alpine valley situated in northwestern Iran near the sprawling, modern industrial city of Tabriz.
To understand Roll's Uranian hypothesis, we have to map out how he meticulously aligns the modern topography of the Tabriz Valley with the ancient text. It starts with the concept of the Gan itself, the enclosed, walled garden.
The natural fortress.
Exactly. As you descend into the Adjiche Valley near Tabriz, you realize it is geographically isolated. It's walled in on all sides by towering mountain ranges. It is a natural fortress.
A naturally occurring walled park. But what about the specific internal clues? Because the text mentions God residing on a fiery mountain.
Right. Roll cross-references Genesis with the book of Ezekiel. When Ezekiel prophesies about the king of Tyre, he uses Eden as a comparison, describing it as the mountain of God, where one walks among red-hot coals.
Red-hot coals?
So Roll points to the highest peak enclosing the Tabriz Valley, Mount Zahand. Today, it is a snow-capped mountain, but in antiquity, it was a highly active stratovolcano. For primitive humans living in the valley below, an erupting volcano perfectly matches the description of a divine mountain covered in red-hot stones.
Okay, a walled valley and a volcano. But you cannot claim you found Eden without accounting for the 4 rivers. How does Roll solve the mystery of the missing Pison and Gihon?
He traces the headwaters. The Tigris and Euphrates, as we know, originate in the mountains of eastern Turkey, remarkably close to this region. For the mysterious Gihon, the Genesis text says it winds through the entire land of Cush.
Now, Kush usually means Africa, right?
Right, later biblical writers used Cush to refer to Ethiopia, which caused centuries of geographical confusion. But Roll points out that in older, localized, ancient Near Eastern geography, there was a region called Kashu in the Zagros Mountains.
Kashu, Kush.
Exactly. The river that winds extensively through that specific region is the Araxes River, which flows north of Lake Urmia and empties into the Caspian Sea. Roll identifies the Araxes as the lost Gihon.
And the fourth river, the Pison. The text has a very specific description for this one. Genesis says the Pison winds through the land of Havilah, where there is gold, and it specifically notes that the gold of that land is good, along with aromatic resin and lapis lazuli. It's practically an ancient resource map.
Now, Roll follows that resource map. He identifies the Pison as a river known locally today as the Usun. What is stunning about this identification is that in the local Iranian dialect, the Usun is literally referred to as the Golden River.
You're kidding?
No. And true to the biblical description, it meanders directly through ancient, historically documented gold mines, as well as significant geological veins of lapis lazuli.
So we have a walled valley, an extinct volcano matching the fiery mountain, and 4 river networks that align geographically and geologically with the text. The physical evidence is incredibly compelling.
It's hard to ignore.
It is. But what blew my mind when reading Roll's research is that he doesn't stop with the dirt and the water. He dives deep into the etymology, tracking the names of the people and the places mentioned in the narrative to see if they left a linguistic footprint in the region.
The linguistic echoes Roll uncovers are really where his theory shifts from geographical curiosity to a compelling historical narrative.
Yeah.
Let's look at the story of Cain and Abel.
Okay.
After Cain commits the first murder, the text says he is cursed and exiled from the presence of the Lord, driven out to live in the land of Nod, which is explicitly described as being situated east of Eden.
So Roll looks at a map of the region directly east of his proposed Eden in Tigris. And what does he find?
He finds a district, still known today, called Noki.
Noki. The phonetic survival over thousands of years is just staggering.
It is. But Roll goes further. We discussed earlier the cherubim, the fearsome entities placed at the eastern gate of the garden with a flaming sword to block human access. In later Judeo-Christian tradition, these evolved into terrifying winged angels. But Roll looks for a historical antecedent.
Right, because if this is a historical logbook, the cherubim weren't celestial beings, they were a physical threat.
Exactly. Roll observes that just south of the Noki region, positioned strategically at the head of a major mountain pass, which would serve as a natural eastern gateway into the Tigris Valley, there's an ancient settlement formerly known as Karobad.
Karobad.
In the local dialect, Karobad translates to the settlement of the Karo people. Roll posits that the original cherubim were not angels at all. They were a historical, ferocious tribe of indigenous warriors known as the Karo.
So they were just human guards.
Yeah, their tribal totem may have been an eagle or a winged creature.
Over millennia of oral storytelling, the memory of these fierce human guardians blocking the mountain pass slowly mythologized into the winged, flaming, sword-wielding angels of the biblical text.
That is the perfect example of how mythology operates as distorted history. A real warrior tribe blocking a mountain pass becomes celestial bouncers guarding a magical realm. It makes total logical sense. But what about the main character? Does Roll have a historical theory for Adam himself?
He does, and again, it relies on regional geology. In Hebrew, the name Adam is deeply connected to the word Adama, the dirt we discussed earlier. The name translates roughly to red earth man,
which usually means he was made from clay.
Conventional theological teaching interprets this as a description of God forming him out of red clay, yes. But Roll points out a specific archaeological reality of the Iranian region. Near Lake Urmia, just adjacent to the Tigris Valley, the mountains are incredibly rich in red ochre.
Oh, I see where this is going. Archaeologists have excavated numerous prehistoric graves in this exact area where the human skeletons have been ritually coated in thick layers of red ochre.
A dead giveaway, to quote Roll's rather dark humor in the source.
Exactly. Roll's synthesis suggests that Adam wasn't the first biological human being created ex nihilo from a pile of dirt. Rather, Adam was the historical chieftain of a tribe of Neolithic prehistoric farmers who settled in this specific valley.
He was the leader of the Red Earth people.
He was likely a spiritual leader or shaman. Eve would have been a bride integrated from a neighboring, perhaps nomadic tribe. For Roll, Genesis is an abridged, highly mythologized, but fundamentally factual account of the real lives of the ancient founders of agriculture in the Near East.
And Roll even found an external, extra-biblical text that corroborates this geographical route. He analyzed an ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablet that details the journey of an emissary sent by the Sumerian king Enmerkar.
The Enmerkar tablet, yes.
The tablet describes the emissary traveling far to the north, embarking on a trek to a lush, fertile plain explicitly named Eden, E-D-I-N. The purpose of the trip was to procure, you guessed it, gold and lapis lazuli. The tablet explicitly states that to reach this Eden, the emissary had to traverse exactly 7 mountain passes.
The 7 gates. Roll argues that these 7 physical, geographical mountain passes on the route to the Tigris Valley eventually entered the cultural consciousness and evolved into the later Judeo-Christian mythological concept of the 7 gates of heaven. It is a stunning example of geography transmuting into theology.
Roll's theory is a total masterpiece of synthesis. He is literally pointing to a spot in modern-day Iran and saying the history happened right here.
It's very compelling.
It is. But the beauty of the archaeological debate is that it is never settled. Because as compelling as Roll's mountain fortress is, another highly credentialed archaeologist looks at the same foundational clues and concludes that Roll is looking entirely in the wrong place.
A completely different environment.
Yeah, if Roll believes Eden is in the high alpine valleys, our next source believes that to find Eden, you essentially need scuba gear.
This represents a radical shift in both geography and the scientific disciplines utilized. We are moving from the linguistics of mountain passes to the hard data of paleoclimatology.
Okay, take us underwater.
We are examining theories proposed by Professor Juris Zarins and later heavily supported by the work of archaeologist Jeffrey Rose, as detailed in a comprehensive Live Science article. Their argument is that Eden was indeed a massive, lush, localized floodplain rich with wildlife and converging rivers. But you cannot hike to it today because it is located entirely underneath the modern-day Persian Gulf.
This theory requires us to completely reorient our understanding of the Earth's timeline. We have to go back way further than David Roll's Neolithic farmers. We are talking about the deep timeline of the last ice age.
Yes, to understand the Persian Gulf theory, we have to grasp a massive geological event known as the Flandrian Transgression. During the late Pleistocene, roughly spanning from 75,000 to 8,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of an ice age.
Right.
Because so much of the planet's water was locked up in massive polar and continental glaciers, global sea levels were drastically lower than they are today. We are talking hundreds of feet lower.
Which means the topography of the coastlines was completely different.
Entirely different. The basin that currently holds the Persian Gulf was not underwater. It was a massive dry depression in the earth, roughly the size of Great Britain. And crucially, it was not a desert. While the surrounding regions of the Arabian Peninsula and southern Iran were incredibly harsh, arid, and hostile due to the Ice Age climate, this sunken basin was a sprawling, lush oasis.
Right, because of rivers.
Yes, the hydrology of the basin perfectly matches the Genesis description. It was watered by 4 major converging rivers. You had the Tigris and the Euphrates flowing down from the north. You had the Karun River flowing in from the Iranian plateau to the east.
What about the fourth one?
Fascinatingly, paleogeographers have identified a 4th, now dry fossil river, often referred to as the Wadi Batin, that once flowed powerfully across northern Arabia directly into this basin. These 4 rivers converged in this massive depression, creating an incredibly fertile wetland environment before eventually flowing out into the Indian Ocean.
It was an environmental refuge, a true GAN, a protected zone shielded from the harsh climatic wilderness of the surrounding world. But the critical question is, do we have any hard archaeological evidence that human beings actually lived down in that basin during this period?
We do, and the evidence is mounting. Obviously, excavating beneath the Persian Gulf is incredibly difficult, but archaeologists have excavated sites along the ancient shorelines, such as Jebel Faya 1 in the United Arab Emirates.
Jebel Faya 1.
Right. These sites demonstrate continuous human occupation spanning from 125,000 down to roughly 25,000 years ago. The people living on the edges of this basin were hunter-gatherers. They were nomadic foragers living off the immense natural bounty of the oasis. They didn't have to farm. They lived in a perpetual state of natural abundance. For a hunter-gatherer, this basin was quite literally a paradise.
But the glaciers didn't last forever. The ice started to melt.
This is where the Flandrian Transgression accelerates into a catastrophe. As the global climate warmed and the massive glaciers melted, sea levels began to rise rapidly. Around 8,000 years ago, the rising Indian Ocean finally breached the natural threshold at the Strait of Hormuz.
This is what we were talking about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Exactly. The ocean water came pouring into the basin. This wasn't necessarily a Hollywood-style tidal wave that wiped them out in 10 seconds, but over a relatively short period, perhaps a few generations or even a few decades, the water levels rose inexorably. The rivers backed up. The freshwater oasis was drowned in salt water. The entire ecosystem collapsed.
It was a localized apocalyptic flood. The people living in the basin, these hunter-gatherers who had lived in perfect harmony with a providing environment, suddenly watched their entire world disappear underwater. They couldn't stay. They were violently displaced by climate change.
They were forced to flee. They migrated north, pushing up into the region of Mesopotamia, which is modern-day southern Iraq. But here is the critical historical friction point. When these displaced hunter-gatherers arrived in Mesopotamia, the land was not empty.
Someone was already there.
It was already occupied by a culture known as the Euphrates. And the Euphrates were technologically distinct from the refugees in one fundamental way. They were agriculturalists, they were farmers.
And this cultural collision is where Professor Juris Zarins introduces what I honestly think is the most brilliant sociological interpretation of the entire deep dive.
It really reframes the whole book of Genesis.
It does. Zarins argues that the story of Eden, and specifically the narrative that immediately follows it, the story of Cain and Abel, is not just a moral fable. It is an abridged, highly traumatic, word-of-mouth historical account of the most fundamental shift in human history, the agricultural revolution.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that theory, because it assigns incredibly specific historical roles to the archetypal characters in Genesis.
Right, so think about the two brothers. Abel is explicitly described as a keeper of sheep, a nomadic herdsman, representing the older hunter-gatherer and pastoral lifestyle.
The lifestyle of the refugees.
Exactly. And Cain is described as a tiller of the ground, a settled farmer representing the new agricultural technology of the Euphrates. When Cain murders Abel and God accepts the offering of the herdsman over the farmer, Zarins argues that we are reading a codified cultural memory.
A memory of a conflict.
Yeah, it is the story of the agrarian city-building lifestyle, violently subjugating and replacing the free, nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle.
It is the encoding of a deep societal trauma. The hunter-gatherers from the Gulf Basin lost their lush, free paradise to rising sea levels. They were forced north, clashing with the Euphratean farmers, and ultimately they lost. To survive in this new, harsh, crowded environment, they were forced to assimilate.
They had to give up the old ways.
They had to abandon foraging and submit to the brutal, back-breaking labor of irrigation and agriculture.
Which is exactly what the curse in Genesis says. God tells Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food." Zarins is saying that isn't a magical curse. It is a literal description of what it felt like for a free-roaming forager to suddenly be forced to dig irrigation ditches in the Mesopotamian sun just to survive.
It is a profound explanation for why the myth exists. The myth of Eden was cultivated to explain why humanity had to suffer. Why do we have to toil in the dirt? Why do we have property borders? Why do we build walled cities?
Because we lost our original home to the waters and the farmers took over.
Exactly. The memory of the Gulf Oasis became the memory of Eden. Furthermore, this theory beautifully explains the preponderance of flood myths in the ancient Near East. The biblical story of Noah, the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian flood myths. They are all varied cultural memories of the Flandrian transgression swallowing their ancestral homeland. It anchors the mythology in undeniable, verifiable geological reality.
It provides such an elegant, scientifically grounded solution to the mystery. You have the four rivers, you have the localized destruction, and you have the sociological explanation for the text itself.
It ties everything together.
It really does.
Yeah.
But, true to the nature of a comprehensive deep dive, just when you think you have it completely solved at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, another massive ancient tradition points in the exact opposite direction.
Naturally.
Because what if the true memory of human origins isn't underwater? What if it's located at the literal top of the ancient world?
We are shifting our geographical focus once again, moving from the sunken coastal plains up into the towering peaks of the Caucasus. We are examining the research presented in Artak Movsesian's work, The Sacred Highlands.
The Sacred Highlands.
Right. Movsesian's central thesis is that if you trace the spiritual geography of the ancient Near East to its earliest strata, The diverse cultures of the region consistently pointed toward the Armenian highlands as the absolute epicenter of creation.
If Roll used topography and Zarins used geology, Movsesian is basically using comparative mythology to triangulate the source. And he pulls from some incredibly ancient and authoritative sources, starting with a figure named Berossus. Who is Berossus, and why does his account matter?
Berossus was a highly influential Babylonian chief priest and scholar who lived in the 3rd century BC during the Hellenistic period. He was bilingual and had access to the deepest, oldest cuneiform archives in Babylon. He wrote a comprehensive history of Babylonia in Greek to educate the new Greek rulers.
Okay, so he's a prime source.
A top-tier primary source. In his historical accounts, he details the Babylonian version of the Great Flood, which features a king named Xisuthros.
Xisuthros.
Yes, it's essentially the Babylonian equivalent of Noah.
And where does Xisuthros end up when the waters finally recede?
According to Berossus, drawing on ancient records, when Xisuthros survives the deluge, he is instructed by a heavenly voice to land his vessel near the gods. And Berossus explicitly identifies this geographical land of salvation, where humanity disembarked to restart civilization, as the mountains of Armenia.
So the Babylonians themselves, who lived all the way down in the plains of Mesopotamia, pointed north to the Armenian mountains as the cradle of post-flood humanity.
Exactly.
But Movsesian's research shows that this geographical centering goes back much further than just the flood narrative. It goes back to the very creation of the cosmos.
It does. If we look at the Enuma Elish, the foundational ancient Babylonian creation epic, we see a cosmological battle that actually establishes the geography of the world. In the myth, there is a primal, chaotic, underground freshwater ocean known as the Abzu.
The Abzu.
The wise god Haya Enki engages in combat with the Abzu and slays it. Following his victory, Haya Enki establishes his divine dwelling place directly on top of the conquered Abzu. And from this specific dwelling place, the text says the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow forth to water the earth.
And as we established earlier, the physical geological headwaters of both the Tigris and the Euphrates are located squarely in the Armenian highlands. So the mythology is mapping directly onto the topography.
Exactly. Movsesian details how the ancient inhabitants of this region viewed their own topography in deeply cosmological terms. The central province of the region was known as Barzaraki, which translates directly to Upper Armenia.
Okay.
But in their cosmological worldview, it was considered the literal top of the world. They believed that from this elevated center, 4 massive rivers flowed outward in 4 directions to nourish the 4 corners of the earth, perfectly echoing the 4 rivers of Eden.
And at the center of this geography sits Mount Ararat, or Mesis.
Yes. Greater Ararat was not just viewed as a tall peak, it was venerated as the universal mountain. In ancient cosmology, the universal mountain was the axis mundi, the central pillar holding up the structure of the universe. It was envisioned as a massive geographical umbilical cord that physically and spiritually connected the terrestrial earth to the heavenly realms above. It was the point of ultimate connection.
Examining Movsesian's work alongside Roll and Zarins highlights such a fascinating psychological phenomenon. It reveals how incredibly universal this concept is. Almost every ancient culture we study possesses this innate drive to locate their origins at a navel of the earth, a universal tree, or a sacred mountain.
It's everywhere.
Whether it's the Greeks with Mount Olympus or the diverse cultures of the ancient Near East pointing to Armenia or Iran, there's a profound psychological need to place a pin on a map and declare, right there, that is the center. That is where the magic started, and that is where the chaos was held at bay.
It represents a fundamental human obsession with origins. We are creatures of narrative, and a narrative requires a starting point to make sense of the subsequent journey. If we do not know where we started, we cannot measure how far we have fallen or calculate how to find our way back.
And that obsession, that need to find the X on the map, is never going to fade. As we were researching this deep dive, I came across a headline from ArchaeoNews, dated just recently in 2026.
Oh, I saw this.
It claimed that a new team using advanced computational analysis and AI modeling believes they have pinpointed a non-traditional, previously unconsidered location for Eden beneath the pyramids of Egypt.
Incredible.
Now, whether that holds any archaeological weight is highly debatable, but it proves the point perfectly. We simply cannot stop looking. We will use ancient Babylonian cuneiform, we will use orbital satellite mapping, we will use deep-sea geological drills, and now we will use artificial intelligence, all to find this one elusive, fortified garden.
The relentlessness of the search speaks to the enduring, unbreakable power of the symbol itself.
But reviewing all this massive contradictory evidence raises a vital question for me as we synthesize this material. If so many distinct ancient texts, Ugaritic tablets, Babylonian creation epics, Hebrew scriptures all seem to point generally toward the headwaters of these great rivers in the highlands of Armenia or Iran, or the sunken basins of the Gulf, what does that actually prove historically?
That's the big question.
Does it prove that all these diverse cultures inherited a true, shared historical memory of an ancestral homeland? Or is the explanation much simpler and more pragmatic? Like, water was so incredibly scarce and precious in the harsh environment of the ancient Near East that wherever the massive river systems originated was simply deemed paradise by default.
Right. Follow the water.
If you have unlimited fresh water, you have life, and therefore you have Eden.
That tension you were describing is the absolute crux of the debate between the physical historians and the comparative mythologists. But perhaps, if we synthesize the vast array of perspectives we've examined today, we can arrive at a more profound conclusion.
Which is what?
Perhaps the exact GPS coordinates simply do not matter as much as the psychological and spiritual truth the narrative is trying to convey. Whether Eden was a real, highly fortified alpine valley in Tigris, guarded by fierce eagle-totem Keru warriors,
Or whether it was a massive lush oasis in the Persian Gulf swallowed by a traumatic climate catastrophe.
or a mythological, sacred mountain peak in Armenia, acting as an umbilical cord to heaven. Eden represents a fundamental, inescapable human truth.
It functions as a mirror.
Precisely. It is a mirror reflecting our innate, agonizing sense that something vital has been lost. It articulates the deeply held human intuition that we once belonged entirely to the natural world, that we were once in rhythm with it, and now, somehow, through some ancient fracture or evolutionary leap, we are painfully separate from it.
Okay, let's bring the vast scope of this deep dive together. We have traversed an incredible amount of intellectual and geographical territory today.
We really have.
We started in the 19th century with the fierce defensive theological battles of 1869, exploring how the literal reality of Eden was viewed as the load-bearing pillar of the entire Christian timeline, necessary to support the Pauline theology of the one man.
The absolute necessity of a historical Adam.
Right. And then we pivoted radically to the 9th century mysticism of John Scotus Erigena, exploring the beautiful Neoplatonic concept that Eden is actually human nature itself, a highly advanced software program designed for infinite progression, currently glitching out in the wilderness, waiting to be debugged through asceticism and union with the divine.
A completely internal landscape.
Then we followed the forensic geography of David Rohl deep into the Zagros Mountains of Iran, tracking rivers of gold and lapis lazuli to find the red ochre graves of Neolithic chieftains. We dove hundreds of feet underwater with Juris Zarins and Jeffrey Rose to discover a sunken Ice Age oasis, uncovering the traumatic sociological memory of hunter-gatherers violently forced into the grueling labor of the agricultural revolution.
The birth of the modern world, essentially.
And finally, we climbed to the very top of the ancient world in the sacred mountains of Armenia, searching for the cosmological navel of the earth.
It is a staggering testament to the complexity of the human imagination and our desperate need for historical context.
And if you are listening to this right now as you drive to work or fold your laundry, you might logically ask, why should I care about any of this? This is ancient history, obscure theology, and speculative archaeology. I have modern problems to deal with.
That's a fair question.
But here's exactly why this deep dive matters to you today. Eden isn't just an archaeological dig site. It is a live mirror reflecting our most pressing modern anxieties. Look at the world we're living in right now. We are still collectively mourning a lost harmony with nature.
We feel it every day.
When we watch the news and see accelerating climate change, mass deforestation, and ecological collapse, what we are feeling is that same ancient ancestral trauma of being kicked out of the garden. We are still profoundly terrified of the wild, unpredictable Adama, the chaotic wilderness operating just outside our doors.
And we react the same way our ancestors did.
We do exactly what ancient humanity did. We are still desperately trying to build a walled garden again to keep the chaos out. We build exclusive gated communities. We construct massive air-conditioned bubbles. We engineer synthetic environments, all in a relentless attempt to recreate that perfect, protected safe zone we feel we inherently deserve, but somehow lost.
That is a remarkably incisive way to apply the ancient texts to contemporary behavior. We are, fundamentally, a species constantly trying to engineer our way back into Eden through technology and architecture. Which brings me to a final, somewhat provocative thought I want to leave you with. Something to mull over long after the audio of this deep dive stops playing.
Lay it on us.
If Professor Juris Zarins is correct, and the story of Eden is actually a traumatic cultural memory of humanity, leaving behind our wild, free, hunter-gatherer days to build the rigid structures of civilization and agriculture. What happens to the human psyche when our civilization reaches its absolute technological peak?
Oh, that's interesting.
Look at what we are building today. We are developing highly advanced artificial intelligence. We are designing entirely virtual worlds, synthetic metaverses where, theoretically, there is no sickness, no physical death, and no manual labor. Are we, in our supreme technological hubris, attempting to construct a new digital Eden?
A completely artificial Dan.
And if we actually succeed, if we manage to upload human consciousness into a perfect, painless, frictionless digital garden, will we eventually look back at our messy, physical, struggling, chaotic human world as a lost paradise we never realized we had?
Oh, wow. That completely flips the paradigm. Will the flawed physical Adama become the new Eden that a future digitized humanity mourns in 1,000 years? That is a phenomenally heavy, beautiful concept.
It really makes you think about what paradise actually means to us.
It does. You know, at the very beginning of this deep dive, we talked about Eden being the ultimate lost treasure, a map with a giant red X marking the location of human innocence. But after unpacking all of the theology, the geology, and the psychology today, maybe we've been reading the map wrong this entire time. Maybe the X doesn't mark a specific set of coordinates on the ground. Maybe the X marks us.
The treasure ultimately was the journey of uncovering the architecture of our own minds all along.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you all so much for joining us on this incredible, exhaustive expedition today. Keep questioning the narratives, keep digging into the dirt of history, and as always, stay curious.
That wraps it up for this deep dive. Thanks for watching A Moment in Time podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe.